Morning, friends. Welcome to another section of With All Your Rights. With you, Attorney Cobo-Estrella, trying to speak about different topics relating to legal matters here in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. Today, I would like to briefly touch on a topic that we've been discussing, which is the equal rights of U.S. citizens residing in Puerto Rico. A while back, we had talked about the U.S. versus Baello case, which was a case where the Supreme Court recently determined or opined that citizens of Puerto Rico are not entitled to supplemental Social Security benefits, primarily because Congress has the power to treat Puerto Rico different because of the territorial clause on the Constitution. However, we have presented several arguments in other sections that we have discussed this topic relating to the need to focus on the Puerto Rico Federal Relations Act, which outlines in Section 737 that the right, privileges, and immunities of U.S. citizens residing in Puerto Rico will be respected to the same extent as if Puerto Rico were a state. Why I bring this? Because, when we look at the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., and we analyze this in the perspective of how the U.S. was born on the principle of no taxation without representation. We have discussed before that Puerto Rico pays more taxes, federal taxes, or contributes to the federal taxes more than 6 states of the Union, yet it does not have voting representation. Now, we have mentioned before that Puerto Rico residents have birthright citizenship. They were granted citizenship from birth by federal law. Therefore, our rights, our fundamental rights, should not differ. Now, why do I bring this? Because we have the same situation happening at the nation's capital in Washington, D.C. You have U.S. citizens that are residing in the District of Columbia who are not part of a state, yet they're denied the right to have voting representation in Congress, just like the citizens of Puerto Rico, which is ironic. It's the nation's capital. Which brings us to the question of whether there is really a U.S. citizenship that has different categories. Do we have full citizenship, really, when we're not allowed to vote for members of Congress or elect voting members in Congress or elect the chief of the U.S. Armed Forces when our citizens are allowed or participate in the defense of the country and the armed forces of the United States all around the world? So we need to ask ourselves, as we have discussed before, Puerto Rico can be treated differently as a territory because it really is a possession of the Congress. At the end of the Spanish-American War, it became a territory that belongs to the United States, but its citizens were granted full U.S. citizenship. Now, our rights should not depend on the place that we are residing at this moment. Why I bring this? Because, as we had discussed before, a U.S. citizen can get on a space shuttle, go to the space station, be out there 6 months, who knows how long, yet he would probably be allowed to vote for the President of the United States and elect representing members of Congress that have voting power. Even a U.S. citizen that may travel abroad, be in France or in some other country, would probably be able to vote, yet travels to Puerto Rico, which is part of the U.S., it's a territory and it's under federal jurisdiction, yet they may lose that right to have the power to elect voting members in Congress or to elect the President of the United States, who decides pretty much how federal funding goes into the Puerto Rico jurisdiction. So we bring this point. Are we going to continue with this situation where we have citizens living within the United States, U.S. citizens that have less fundamental rights? I don't think anybody can argue that voting it's not a fundamental right. It is. How can you have citizens living within the United States, in the District of Columbia, and in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico that have less fundamental rights than the rest of U.S. citizens in the other 50 states, when you have the District of Columbia contributes more than 20 to the federal revenue and taxes more than 21 states of the Union, and Puerto Rico contributes more than 6 states of the Union, yet our citizens are not afforded the same fundamental rights. I think it's about time that perhaps Congress should look into allowing all U.S. citizens, regardless of location, to have the same basic fundamental rights, which should include the right to elect voting members in Congress and participate in the elections of the commander-in-chief and the president of the United States, who determines what the policy is for the federal government. That's something that should be brought to the attention, should be considered, because we cannot call ourselves democracy and, wave our flag of the United States around the world and defend freedom when we do not afford and ask other countries to give voting rights to citizenship, when we have a situation where we have millions of U.S. citizens within the United States, 3.5 million U.S. citizens living in Puerto Rico, millions more in the District of Columbia, who are not allowed the same fundamental basic rights that every U.S. citizen should have. So why do I bring this? Because when we go back to this insular cases that dealt precisely with U.S. territories back in the Down versus Bidwell in 1901, it represented sort of a racial bias toward what they considered at the time many people alien races, including the people living in Puerto Rico. Why? Because we were bringing this vision that was back in the decision when the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson, which pretty much made it lawful to segregate in schools and public facilities. There was a racist view at the time in the country, whether we like it or not, that's a reality. And there was a situation and racial tensions were strong. And that vision of excluding races that were different than the Anglos at the time existed. It was prevalent. And whether we like it or not, at the time that these cases, the insular cases, were resolved by the Supreme Court, they had this vision as to whether Puerto Rico was an unincorporated territory, and therefore it was not like us, the incorporated, the United Territories of the United States, and therefore they had different rights. That changed over the years. Fast forward to the 1950s, Browns versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court determined that the decision back in Plessy was wrong, and they ordered the inclusion of schools of racial, different races, and it changed the views. And I think we're about time of having that situation happen with the insular cases, where we can determine perhaps it is time to change that vision and not use racial bias as a way of saying, okay, we're not going to, like just happened with this case of U.S. versus Baello, we're going to not allow supplemental Social Security to U.S. citizens because supposedly they do not contribute to the federal income tax revenue, which is not true. And try to change that vision and say, okay, perhaps we should deal with the citizenship differently than we do with the possession, which is a territory. Perhaps the territory, yes, Congress has the power to do with the territory what it wants, but perhaps citizens should be afforded the same rights, because it should not change. I should be able to get on a plane, travel freely within the United States, and my rights should not change on the state or location that I'm in, because I still have a U.S. passport. I'm still a U.S. citizenship. I'm still a U.S. citizen whether I get on a plane and travel to France. I'm still a U.S. citizen if I board a space shuttle and I go to outer space, to the space station. I should not have less rights because I decide to come back to Puerto Rico and live here as a resident. And I bring this to your attention because I talked to personal experience back before the year 2000 that I lived in Florida for approximately 15 years where I raised. I was able to participate in the electoral votes, both for Congress, both for the President of the United States. Yet in the year 2000, 2001, I relocated to Puerto Rico and I lost that right. So I'm speaking of personal experience. Does that make any sense? I don't think it should. I have a U.S. passport. I'm a U.S. citizen. I love my country. I learned the Pledge of Allegiance back when I went to Vernon Park High School. I still know it by heart after 20 years. I don't think that I should have less rights than any other U.S. citizen that lives anywhere else in the United States. And I think there are many, many Puerto Rico professionals who love the United States, who love their country as well, or Puerto Rico, who feel that perhaps we should be treated fairly and be given an opportunity, because I also know perhaps people who are not natives of Puerto Rico who have relocated to Puerto Rico. I have represented Anglos that have moved to Puerto Rico who feel the same way we do. Why is this different? Why do we get treated differently? I'm still a U.S. citizen. I haven't left the United States. I'm still within the U.S. jurisdiction. So food for thought for people. in the United States to think about this, members of Congress, analyze this, and perhaps it's about time that, we try to respect all basic fundamental rights for all U.S. citizens. So I hope this was thoughtful information. It was helpful. As always, if you have any questions regarding your legal rights, consult with your attorney. We're federal trial attorneys here in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. It's been a pleasure to be with you. You guys have a good day. Take care.